and I wanted to show my appreciation for having the opportunity to be here on Noongar land and to hear some of the philosophy and understanding, it feels much better, an understanding that Aboriginal peoples have developed over so many thousands of years, and we've got so much to learn in governance and management, education, that I hope that we are on the path to learning those lessons. And I'm talking today representing government and the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions on a topic that I've been working in for over 20 years. It was one of my first jobs when I started with the department to look at guidance for developing appropriate wetland buffers to protect the values of wetlands. 20 years on plus, we're still working on the guidance, and it's a work in progress. It is a controversial topic. The very title of my original talk, which had to be changed due to the sensitivity of the topic, as half of my slides have also been removed because of the sensitivity of the topic, and the process that I've been through to actually be standing here and giving a presentation has been testament to the sensitivity of having a policy to direct development over wetlands. And so we can't get away from the contentious issue that establishing appropriate buffers is in the planning process. And I'm not sure if you heard my question this morning or comment to that excellent presentation this morning, is that part of the reasons, there's lots of reasons for the contention, but two of them anyway, one of them is the value that we have on land, the dollar value on land. And I think the reason for that is so much of the land that is developable was either on wetlands or around wetlands, and it was an amazing place in the 1800s and earlier, and I can understand why it was so valued by Aboriginal peoples for the incredible diversity and opportunities for a wonderful life in Perth and metropolitan area. And the other reason, I think, for the contention is the difficulties we have in actually putting dollar values on the services that wetlands provide to us as a human species. And we've lost that understanding that we are connected, all the species are connected, and the processes which maintain the species are connected, and that wetlands are indeed living entities and they respond to how they're managed. And so it's an ongoing issue. We haven't arrived at a solution yet, but I'm being involved in the work on it, and I'll continue to be involved in it. So I will be mentioning our role, the department's role in science and wetlands, how buffers contribute to wetland function, how buffers contribute to maintaining ecosystem services, how science can inform appropriate buffers, and some of the case studies of wetland buffers, and some approaches that have been tried and should be utilised or tried for establishing appropriate buffers. So just very briefly, our department, the science program that I work in, undertakes a lot of biological surveys of wetlands, and also research to look at the complex interactions between wetlands and drylands, and the role that it have in maintaining species in the landscape. This information is put into reports, and some of it goes into databases, and those databases assist us in providing information to the planning process, the decision makers in the planning process. And so it allows us to show what the values are of wetlands and the potential impacts from clearing or urban development, industrial development, agricultural clearing around wetlands, so what those impacts are likely to be. The department does a lot of monitoring particularly of high-value wetlands and wetlands that we manage in the conservation estate, including Ramsar wetlands. One of the important roles is in mapping wetlands, and we are the custodian of many of the wetland mapping layers that exist for the state. And that they're very important for showing where the wetlands are in the landscape, the connection between wetlands and their relative values and opportunities we have for managing them, and also identifying which ones really have retained the most important values that could be brought into the conservation estate. So what are wetland buffers? Well, buffers involve separating wetlands from adjacent land uses, and these land uses change, and the process of allowing that change is to go through a process of gaining permission to change the land use. And so buffers are a part of a way of separating an altered land use that might threaten the values of the wetlands. And so there's lots of examples of clearing of land leading to increased sedimentation rates that move into the wetland, projects that are the end result of the land use, which could include fertilizers on turf that will run in and change the chemistry of wetlands, urban development that can lead to increased access to the wetlands, trampling of vegetation, light pollution, air pollution, disturbance to nesting waterbirds. All of these impacts can be and should be managed through a buffer system. Wetland buffers should also function to protect the wetland values, but also the ecosystem services provided by the wetland. And for those of you who live very close to wetlands would be aware of some of the issues that wetlands present to those who live very close to them. And so nuisance insects are one of them. And I'll be presenting some of the science behind what an appropriate buffer could account for the distance-wise if you were going to manage for nuisance insects, because it's quite surprising. And the important role that wetlands have in flood control as well is a very important one. And there's so many examples in the Perth metropolitan area where inappropriate buffers have led to flooding and neglecting the ephemeral nature of wetlands. And so the boundaries of wetlands have been created in a time when there was very wet conditions, and we often still get those very wet conditions under certain circumstances, and that can lead to damage to property and infrastructure when those wetlands do wet up again, and they often will and do. So establishing adequate buffers is really just one of the important steps in managing and conserving wetlands. Having integrated management of the catchment is also critical, and probably more critical. If we're not managing the ecological linkages from other wetlands and other dryland vegetation, we're not managing the hydrological linkages and allowing unplanned clearing and use of herbicides and pesticides in the catchment, these will start running into the wetland and degrading them. So wetland buffers have to be considered in a holistic way in how we manage catchments, and I think we're a long way from that yet. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in the future. So I wanted to talk about the role that buffers have in maintaining wetland function, and one of those functions is the habitat. A habitat that is required to maintain the fauna and the wildlife that use wetlands. And so I've just summarised some of the research that is available on the requirements of some of these fauna. So avifauna, the water birds, use that area around the wet parts for nesting, roosting and foraging. And the research shows that they're using this area between 100 metres and 800 metres from the water's edge. And so it is a consideration that these need to be taken into account. If we're clearing within that area, we're going to be impacting on the success of the water birds that are using the wetlands, protecting frogs, their lifestyle. Again, they're showing between 159 and 290 metres from the water's edge. It's a habitat area that's really used a lot by frogs in their life cycles. The odonates, the dragonflies and damselflies, it's been shown that they move up to 160 metres from the edge of the water. The males more so than the females for dragonflies. And that is critical for maintaining these food webs and the cycles that wetlands have of the fauna. Quenda, they're not recognised as being wetland-dependent animals, but they do like the dense vegetation that grows around wetlands. The sedges, they're often the last stronghold, and through creek systems and waterways throughout the state, they congregate around those dense vegetation areas. And we know that they move between 200 and 800 metres from these areas. Reptiles, there's a whole plethora of studies that show their movement around wetlands. The eastern snake-necked turtle has been shown to move up to 375 metres and more in certain circumstances. The southwestern snake-necked turtle, which I think Jane Chambers is talking about later, have been shown to move for their egg-laying up to 800 metres from the edge of wetlands. And so how do we manage these areas to maintain these populations is something that is problematic, and we're not taking the science into account in a lot of the planning decisions at this stage. Anecdotal evidence from the southwest shows that quokka populations in the southwest also like these dense vegetation around wetlands, and they can move from 100 metres up to 40 kilometres from the riparian zones. Again, anecdotal evidence of the ringtail possum again is around 40 kilometres that they move from peppermint stands, woodlands that grow close to wetlands. Those of you who work in wetland management know that government for a long time has had a standard advice on having a minimum buffer of 50 metres for our highest value wetlands, the conservation category wetlands. And it's long been recognised that this is already a compromise with the development industry, but it is something which is likely to provide protection to a majority or a lot of these species. I'd like to say long term, but it's certainly we've shown that these species are holding on where appropriate buffers have been applied. An essential role of buffers is for maintaining water quality. And so I've talked about what happens in the catchment impacts the wetlands that are at the bottom of the catchment. We get drainage that moves into wetlands, and the buffers can assist with acting as the lungs, as the kidneys and the liver for wetlands, and they have such an important role for filtering out many of these nutrients and pollutants and aerosols that can move in from the catchments. And so it's vital that these buffers are maintained, and where they lack vegetation through other land use changes that have taken place, then we would advise that they need to be revegetated using endemic species and replacing some of that ability for the buffer to act as a filter. So again, I've just summarised some of the studies that show the effectiveness of buffers in removing nutrients, and the papers suggest that up to 200 metres in transmissive soils, so these are the soils where liquids move through very quickly, where there's not a lot of capacity to absorb the nutrients and the pollutants. and 100 metres for less transmissive soils that might include loam and clay particles that are much better at holding on to some of these unwanted nutrients. Nitrogen is one of those. It's so mobile. It's one of our more mobile ions in solution, and having buffers even of 10 metres has been shown to account for between 30 and 50% of nitrogen moving into wetlands, particularly when they're densely vegetated. Up to 50 metres can absorb 100% of nitrates moving into systems, and so buffers play such an important role. Again, in heavy metal contamination, they have a role in forming complexes and stopping these heavy metals from moving into wetlands. And having water-sensitive management in the drainage systems can also assist in that process. They help reduce sedimentation. If we're talking about protecting groundwater quality, then it's really open to discussion, but some of the papers suggest up to 2 kilometres, some suggest a lot more if we want to protect water quality of the groundwater systems moving into wetlands. We all know that wetlands often, in fact, the majority of all wetlands are windows into the groundwater, and so what happens to where groundwater forms is going to be impacting on the value of these wetlands and their capacity to support the wildlife in them. Buffers are critical for maintaining habitat of wetlands, and so some of the studies show that weeds and the invasion, it's a big threat, a big threatening process and impact on wetland function. And so having a buffer of 10 metres can stop some weeds from moving in, but unfortunately we need probably between 50 and 100 metres to stop all weeds from encroaching. Anything less, there will be an ongoing need to control weeds in that wetland. They help prevent inappropriate access. And so I think access, we all understand, is vital to allow people to use wetlands, to learn about wetlands, to understand their connection to wetlands. And so having access is important, but it has to be managed. And inappropriate access where trail bikes and four-wheel drives move through and people without control of pets can lead to trampling of vegetation, destruction of nests of waterbirds, can increase light, noise and rubbish dumping. And the separation distance is also helps in controlling pets and predation that comes from pets. I wanted to include this photo. I know you can't see what's in that circle, but it's actually a cat. And the interesting part of this slide and a couple of others was it came from a legal process that I was involved in the State Administrative Tribunal, where a last-minute presentation of the consultancy showed 10 wetlands that were given as examples of where less than 50 metres were used as buffers, were leading to good management of the wetland. And so I had the opportunity the night before I was appearing as a witness to go and have a look at these wetlands, and all of these photos have actually come from those 10 sites. And so it is interesting that they included a buffer of around 5 to 10 metres where weeds were encroaching into the edge of that wetland, and it had moved through this magic fence that was somehow going to stop the weeds. And there was an ongoing management issue. Rubbish dumping was very easy to do when you've got a 10-metre buffer. Very easy to, when you've finished building and the builders have a problem with what are they going to do with the excess material, they can very easily go over a fence. And again, we all like our pets, and cats, unfortunately, are a bulldozer on the environment and on the ecology of wetlands. And so this little cat was sitting just inside that magic fence on another one. So Buffers can help. They don't do everything, but they're part of the solution. Buffers have a role in protecting the ecosystem services that wetlands provide to us. And I've talked about the nuisance insects, and Ross River virus has been shown to increase by 11 times within 3 kilometres of breeding sites of mosquitoes. So maintaining these separations from where we live to these beautiful places that we all value is an important consideration in the planning process. Their role in controlling flooding and odour is also critical, and some of that is also managed by the management of water quality. They have a role in the human amenity, probably the most critical role and the most difficult to put a dollar value on, and the cultural values that the Aboriginal people have showed us for thousands of years. The importance of these wetlands to our spirit is critical, and the number of people who want to live either near the ocean or near a wetland indicates the importance we still hold on living close to water, living close to something that gives us peace and a feeling of security and connection. They offer so many sporting opportunities and passive recreation opportunities for bird watching, photography, and even dog walking. They're all part of our amenity that we value. Scientific and education values of wetlands, they're maintained by buffers, and often the buffers are the most critical part of it. And lastly, the importance of wetlands. We're starting to understand the importance as a carbon sink and the role that they can have in managing the future and maintaining human ability to live on this land. And so protecting these important carbon sinks with a buffer makes all sorts of sense. And it's the edge of the wetlands that are often the most productive and for so many things, not only the biological elements of it, but the chemical elements and the physical elements. And so these edge between water and dry land are so critical to protect, and they're involved in so many of the processes that maintain wetlands. A couple of case studies to finish off with, and I have to point out that a lot of the case studies I'm not able to present today, but they're a result of the legacy of past planning decisions where we didn't know as much about the impacts, and so I think we've got a lot to learn, and I think we can improve our planning process. And I've just chosen two here. Herdsman Lake was one that was altered very early on in settlement. It has historical planning outcomes. It's a wetland that has been used by Aboriginal peoples for many thousands of years, and why not? It's a perfect place to live. It provided so much food, so much resources for the daily needs of people between the ocean and the river. It's a perfect place, and we know that it was at least 150 metres wider than what it is today. And a lot of the urban development that has gone through approvals have meant that it's on wetland now, and some of the impacts of the roads around it, if anyone's driven along the John Sanders Drive, will probably know what I'm talking about. It's built on peat sediments, and people say that it's like being in the ocean. That sort of dipping feeling that you get when you're in the ocean and there is subsidence happening. The result of this is that it becomes expensive. It becomes expensive to manage these impacts for councils, for state governments, and I think we can do better, and I think we need to learn from this era where we didn't know the impacts of not having buffers, or we didn't know the importance of maintaining buffers in management of wetlands. Forestdale Lake. I'm presenting this one because it's a Ramsar listed wetland. It's such a beautiful place to be. It's also on conservation estate. So my department manages Forestdale Lake with the help of many great friends of Forestdale Lake, and I know there's one or two in the room today and at this conference, and the department is so appreciative of the work that they do. The blue line around the edge of the wetland, so the dark green area is the mapped conservation category wetland, and the blue line around it is a 50-metre line. And in this example, we've actually been quite successful in maintaining the habitat around the wetlands. So generally, there's a 50 to 100 metre buffer and more in parts of it. There's good connectivity to other wetlands and dryland habitats, and so it's helping to maintain the values of it. And there's one thing that hasn't been managed, and that's what happened in the landscape. And so water flows to the wetland have diminished significantly since settlement, and the damming of Wollongong Dam was part of that. The changing of the hydrological flows in the catchment has been a significant part of it, and climate change is another part of it. And so there are issues with Forestdale Lake. It's drying out. There's a gradual terrestrialisation of the vegetation in and around the lake, and that brings with it issues that need management as well. So there's fire is an ongoing issue, weeds are an ongoing issue, and the habitat for migratory birds that use this wetland every year on the long migration route. Those values are not there every year where they used to be. So there are ongoing issues, and that's why we need to look at what happens in the catchment as well as maintaining these buffers. I better finish up, and I just want to very quickly go through some of the mechanisms that can drive improved management, and this is just speaking from my cap in advising the planning system, and it's not talking from being here today and listening to the Aboriginal knowledge of how wetlands could be managed. But a couple of the mechanisms include the Environmental Protection Act, which defines wetlands and establishes the environmentally sensitive areas. So they're gazetted. So these are areas where the environmental impact assessment has to think very carefully about protecting the wetland plus a 50-metre buffer around that wetland. And so it is an important mechanism, and one that can drive improved management of these systems. Secondly is the Planning and Development Act, which is allowing for a series of state planning policies, and one of them has been reviewed and went out for public comment at the end of last year, 2.9, Planning for Water Resources. And it has a set of ideals, very broad ideals and principles that talks about managing the water quality and hydrological regimes which allow wetlands to function. So it's got a lot of great ideals in there. 6.2 talks about adequate foreshore areas and wetland buffers to maintain, protect and manage and conserve water quality and native vegetation. So these are drivers, and this is what keeps me hopeful that this will lead to guidance, which is very black and white on how we can start to set buffers that will be appropriate and allow for sustainable development. Just a couple of the approaches that have been considered in the past. One is having a straight 50-metre buffer. So this is a wetland in the south. Originally, it had a boundary mapped by this green line. When we took a look at this as an example of how we can develop buffer guidance, we realised that it was surrounded by a sedge community, which was very dependent on water. It might be waterlogged, but it was still an important part of the wetland itself. And outside that was a Melaleuca woodland, again, dependent on having access to water to be waterlogged for a part of the year. So the actual boundary of the wetland is this red line. And then if we apply a straight 50-metre buffer, it takes it out to this area. Now, it's not ideal. It's a compromise, as I said, on the habitat requirements of the wildlife, but it is something which has been considered by developers in the past, challenged, yes, but often upheld by our environmental impact assessment and planning processes. Another approach is to establish the wetland buffer and then to look at what's the habitat requirements of the fauna that's in that wetland, and that's called an ecological function zone. And so this was trialled in 2005 as a draft, and it does prove it's more expensive for developers to do all of the surveys to find out the important values of a wetland and then come up with identifying these dryland areas that support these fauna. But it is another approach. And then buffers are established around the edge of that ecological function zone. So we begin to protect not only the wetland, but also the important habitat values of that wetland. And I'll just finish off with the role that wetlands have and the function they have, or what allows that function to continue, is the connection in the landscape, the hydrological connection and the ecological connection. For those of you who know this area, this is a peninsula near Albany, and there's an A-class nature reserve in this area up here, and the Torndirrup National Park is down in this area. And so it forms an important connection between these reserve areas, and the identification of an appropriate buffer should take into account the importance of where drainage water comes from and the importance of having good quality water coming into the wetland. This is the only water body on the peninsula, and it is used heavily by the fauna moving across these remnant vegetation reserves. Very critical. We need to again take some lesson from our Aboriginal people who've been using this land and managing this land in this way, recognising the connection of landscape to these values. So critical. In conclusion, it's really just what I've been saying. It's essential to view wetland buffers in conjunction with other consideration management strategies and combining a holistic solution to the problems of managing wetlands in a landscape. Wetland buffers are an important consideration within government decision processes, and they're difficult. It's a complex and difficult job that government have, and I think unless we develop the partnerships with community and other interest groups, it's difficult for government to go out on a limb and say we're going to limit the developable land. We need to work in partnership, and so important to have a scientific understanding of wetlands and to guide in the policy making and management. Thank you very much.